Is things getting better? Sam?
Yes,
okay.
yes.
Things are getting better.
Much better.
But it's going to be a tough climb for her and her family and for Matt. And so y'all please add, her name's Antoinette. Y'all please add Antoinette to your prayers. And also Sarah, a little 5-year-old girl who ended up in the emergency room in Austin, the granddaughter of one of our members here. And this just happened today, so please keep Sarah in your prayers. We'd really appreciate that. And of course, Pastor Greg, always ongoing in our prayers. And so I'd like to ask Bill Hussey to come up and lead us in a prayer. And then we'll do the pledges, and we'll go from there. Bill Hussey from Llano.
Let us pray. Heavenly Father, we have so much to be thankful for. We live in a great country. We thank you for the ladies and men that are here tonight, those that couldn't be here that are here in spirit, the ones that love you and listen to you and follow your guidance and care about their country and their state and their community. We ask you to take care of our military active duty. Thank you for the veterans and our first responders. They do such amazing work for not much attention. We ask that you guide and direct us as we go about our daily lives, but we thank you for that. We ask that you protect and watch over us as we go about our daily businesses, and we ask that you comfort us as those that are hurting tonight in our communities around the world, and guide and protect them as well. We ask that the things that we do for your glory. We ask those things in your name. Amen.
I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Honor the Texas flag. I pledge allegiance to thee, Texas, one state under God, one and indivisible. Yeehaw! And if you're new to the Fredericksburg Tea Party group, we got this yeehaw thing going, and we're known all over the state for our yeehaw. And I have to tell, I've said this many times in public, I stole it from a nice little redheaded lady from West Texas somewhere. But anyway, but we've carried on the tradition for her. Kat, y'all know Kat Rowland. She's been around for a while, and Rowald. Kat, would you please come up here and introduce our speaker? Thank you.
Needless to say, I was not prepared, so I did a little introduction of her last night, and so I have my cheat sheet from last night. So anyway, many of you here tonight, this may be the very first time that you're going to hear about what's really going on in Europe, about the death of freedom of speech, about refugees who are really people who are invading countries with a pre-planned agenda. It's not just Europe, it's happening here in America, even in Texas. You've heard about those caravans, right? Down in Mexico coming our way. When you work in this field, it's challenging on many, many fronts, and because truth is sometimes, I think people do not want to hear, because then you have to take responsibility for it and have to deal with it, make decisions based on it, and therefore ignoring it, pretending it doesn't exist, is a nice desire, because then your bubble doesn't burst and you live in your happy world. Either you will learn truth and take responsibility for it, or truth will be forced on you and you won't have a choice left to make. We're at that point today here in America, surprisingly so. Our guest speaker tonight has an interesting background. Elisabeth Sabaditsch Wolff, a daughter of a diplomat. Austria is her home country. Her father was in the United States a good bit while she was growing up, so Elisabeth came to know America, our language, our Constitution, and our customs in her early years. This is when her love for the States began. A lot of people that follow me on ChristianReporterNews.com have heard me mention Elisabeth at times as something very unique. Elisabeth managed to be at all the wrong places at just the right time to be on the front lines of history for the last 40 years. She's going to share that story with you tonight. It gives her a very unique perspective and reality that she's bringing to the table for us. And my initial interview with Elisabeth, I didn't know who she was. And Roy Watt had brought her in and had me there. A lot of y'all know Roy. And so he sends us up in a room. Y'all go in there, do an interview, Cap. So we're sitting across the table. I know her. And so I just started, kind of working the interview. And, watching my watch and, trying to keep it 30 minutes. And she went, no. Well, I'm telling you my story. She had me in tears. And still chokes me up to this day because of some of the things she has experienced and choices that she's had to make that none of us have any clue is really going on in this world. We don't realize how fortunate we are. So Elisabeth is a fighter for freedom of speech. You see, Elisabeth was arrested for speaking truth at an event. She was discussing Muhammad, the founder of Islam, the man who they consider to be the model of a man, one who all the men should copy and imitate with their lives. She was sharing the documented facts, from the Quran. Then he married Aisha when she was 6 and consummated that marriage when she was 9. And she asked the audience, so what do you call that if it's not pedophilia? That one sentence. When the judge realized which it was the truth, it was the truth. When the judge realized he was about to sentence her for speaking the truth, he changed the charges against her from the bench to speaking against a nationally recognized religion. She'll give you that in a little more defined in a little bit. She is still fighting that conviction. Now, up to the equivalent of the Supreme Court of the European Union, that's my term, she'll give you the exact one. They just upheld that ruling. But she's going to appeal it, thank God. But when that ruling came down, October 25th, a month ago, the buzz was everywhere immediately. Tucker Carlson on Fox News was even talking about it. You see, you're seated in here with Miss S from Austria. They didn't even bother to use her real name. They didn't bother to call her to let her know what the verdict was. She read it in the news like I did. And so anyway, but all the news wires were all abuzz about Miss S. And their headline was, "Freedom of Speech died today." Can happen here. We've had it happen here. We had an incident in San Angelo, May the 4th of this year, where I hosted an event, and John Wandello spoke, and it was a training deal for law enforcement officers, and they loved it. They were so proud of their hours they learned, till CARE put a little pressure, and their hours were rescinded. Truth being denied. And now Facebook, Twitter, PayPal, constant contact is cutting off all these people who are trying to speak truth. Truth is being lost. It's been denied here in Texas, in Fredericksburg, in San Angelo, all around the country. But we got to fight. And Elisabeth is leading the way. So if y'all would give a good Fredericksburg welcome to Elisabeth Sabaditsch Wolff.
Thank you for your wonderful applause. Thank you for introducing me again. I think you did very well. And that's why I picked you to introduce me, because you know me well. Again, thank you very much for everybody who showed up tonight. I really appreciate it. I know you could be doing a million things other than listening to bad news, because usually when I arrive, I am the bearer of bad news. I don't have any good news, which is very unfortunate, but that's, I suppose, my line of business that I'm in. I'm generally a happy person, but I just don't have anything good to tell you about. But I guess that's what I was chosen to do. And yeah, maybe one of these days, thanks to you, we will have some good news. I think it would be time, because I've been in this business for 10 years now, and I do need some good news for a change. I'm going to tell you I'm going to tell you about myself, because other than Kat and Tammy over there, I don't think we've met. I think we have, yeah. But most of you, or all of you, don't know my story. And other than the introduction that I was hauled before court, and you know, it wasn't a pleasant experience, but you don't know how I got there. How does one get to become a fighter for free speech? You see, I'm an Austrian, but nobody in Austria really knows what freedom of speech is, what it's all about, why we need it. And even before all the so-called migrants came into our country, people didn't know what freedom of speech was. We just don't have that tradition in Austria. So let me tell you a little bit about my life, the last 47 years of my life, and then hopefully you will understand why I do what I do. So I was born not in Austria, but in Switzerland, in Geneva to be precise. My father was, or is, a retired diplomat, Austrian diplomat, working in the Foreign Service, and one of his first postings was to Geneva, Switzerland. We then, my family, my mother, my sister, and I, along with my father, then moved to New York in 1975. I attended kindergarten there for 2 years, learned English for the first time, lost it again after we moved on. In 1977, my life, now looking, you know, with 2020 hindsight, I can tell you in 1977, my life changed in a very dramatic way, because my father was transferred to the Austrian embassy in Iran, in Tehran. And you know what happened in 1978. You know what happened on November 4th, 1979. I was 6 or 7 years old at the time, and you know, I knew Iran during the Shah era, fairly Western oriented. You were allowed to drink, you were allowed to eat whatever you wanted, you were allowed to, you could walk the streets dressed the way we are today. As a matter of fact, the women enjoyed living a Western life, and those who wanted to cover up and, you know, in the rural areas, they were allowed to do so. It wasn't really a problem. And then the unrests began, the demonstrations. I remember very vividly all the Allahu Akbar screams from the roofs of the houses. I still hear them. And life changed overnight from a Western-oriented society, as mentioned before, to a completely theocratic society. From a completely Western-oriented to a non-Western, to a hatred of the West, in particular of the United States. My father, for instance, his office was located right above the American embassy. You could see into the compound when he was working, and he could see what was going on with the American hostages at the time. And to this day, I can't understand how Jimmy Carter could have botched this thing so badly.
Amen.
It's unbelievable, and we're still suffering the consequences right now. You know, we should have stood up, we, the West, America, and the rest of the West, should have stood up to the thug, Ayatollah Khomeini. So thanks to Jimmy Carter, we are now in a very dire situation with respect to Islam. My mother, my sister, and I were kicked kicked out of the country in the middle of the night in late 1978. We were taken to the airport. I still remember very vividly the masses and masses of people. You know, I was, you know, this size, and I was looking up and I saw all these people. I mean, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people congregated at the airport. To this day, I feel very uncomfortable around a lot of people. I stay away, you know, from many people. I also remember my father was so nervous about getting us out of the country safely that he vomited all over himself at the airport. I remember him wearing one of these ugly, ugly turtlenecks. To this day, I remember it was a turquoise, one of these 1970s ugly turquoise turtlenecks. He was wearing that turtleneck that night when he took us to the airport. And somehow I got lost at the airport, you know, with all these people. And, you know, maybe that was the reason why he vomited. And then I was carried, you know, above all the masses of people back to my parents. And I remember how frightening that was. And we made it out of the country safely, and my family was separated for approximately 2 years. We could only visit my dad during the summer vacation, Easter and Christmas. The rest of the year we were separated. And you can imagine it also took a toll on my mother. It wasn't easy at all to be separated. And I know the feeling, I can relate to that feeling because my husband, who is in the Austrian army, was deployed to Mali in Africa in 2013. And my daughter and I were separated from him for 9 months. And there was no internet, there was no phone, there was no Skype. We could only talk on the phone once a week for 10 minutes. That was it. And for security reasons, he had to change phone numbers every other week. So I can relate to how difficult it is to be separated. And you can believe me, it was also very tough when he was deployed to Mali, that he had to, you know, hand in some hair and some other tissue samples in case he was killed. And I told him, if you're ever captured and paraded on TV, don't ever think that I will go on TV and in a hijab beg for your release. I will not do that. So we agreed on that. But my husband's, he's a good soldier. He did not get captured. He wasn't captured. And I also knew he had a way out. He told me exactly how he would escape from Mali if it was needed. It wasn't. He's back safely. Everything's okay, and we have been recovering ever since. My daughter and I. It was a very tough time. Anyway, so I know what my mother was going through, and even back then, all we had was a telephone, and that service was very intermittent. So it was a very, very tough time. But we spent our, like I said, summer vacations in Tehran. I do have fond memories, despite the tension that was in the air, despite all the demonstrations of the many thousands of women in their hijab and the cloak that's called chador, which frightened me as a young girl. And I also remember that my mother, in the middle of the night, cooked for the 2 American hostages held at the Iranian Foreign Ministry, because they did not get any food. And the embassy, of course, couldn't take care of them. The American embassy couldn't take care of them because they were hostages themselves. So that's what my mother did, and my father then drove to the Iranian Foreign Ministry to deliver the food in a safe car. And to this day, I still have at home a little file of the drawings of one of the hostages. His name was Bruce Lingen, and we exchanged letters. You know, as a 7-year-old, as a 7-year-old, wrote letters to this hostage, and he returned watercolors watercolor pictures of what he imagined Austria to look like, and you know, all the mountains and the water, and very beautiful drawings, paintings. I still have them at home and I treasure them. It was a very tough time for him, but also for my mother, who wanted to feed her children and couldn't do it because the food had to go to a great extent to those hostages who needed to survive. 1979 was the main revolution, and in 1980, my father was on the last airplane, September 25th, I think it was. 1980, my father was on the last airplane out of Iran before the war started, the Iran-Iraq War. Prior to that, on July 31st, 1980, our Iranian maid burned down our house in Tehran. My mother, my sister, and I were inside the house. We made it out. The reason she set fire to the house was during the time that my mother was out of the country, she had stolen clothes from my mother from her closets. My dad, of course, didn't care, didn't look, didn't pay attention. But when my mother returned at the beginning, when we returned after the school year had finished, of course my mother noticed that there was a lot of stuff missing. And she asked her, you know, where's all my clothes? And of course she denied it, but who else? There was no one else in the house, so. And she was the one who set fire to our house. And then, of course, she was never arrested or tried or anything. And so that was another, I could see, you know, at first she was very nice to us. Her name was Mariam. I remember her. I remember the way she, you know, what she looked like. And then all of a sudden she was caught by my mother, an infidel, of course. And she just totally turned around, totally flipped. That hatred in her eyes. Again, this is something I remember, something I saw. This is not something I believe is true. It is true. I saw it with my own eyes, and I experienced. I opened the door, and there was all this fire, and we couldn't get out of the house, and we were already contemplating jumping into the swimming pool. And then we were saved by our neighbors and, ironically enough, American fire trucks. Yep.
Nice.
Yep. So the U.S. Was kind enough to deliver fire trucks during the Shah era that were used even during Khomeini's reign of terror. So that was my first brush with Islam. Okay, I experienced Islam those months that I was there. But I didn't really know what to make of it other than the experience of the oppression that I felt as a young girl. In 1982, my father was called to fill in for the ambassador in Baghdad, in Iraq. And so my family and I spent Christmas in Baghdad, in Iraq, Christmas and New Year. Remember, the war was going on. So I was on the other side of the war. First it was Iran, and then Iraq. We spent, like I said, Christmas and New Year. We went to church there, no problem at all. It was safe. We were not afraid. Of course, I knew we were in a dictatorship. Don't get me wrong. I know exactly what an evil man Saddam Hussein was. But it's interesting how dictatorships are usually very safe countries for those, on the right side, okay? And of course, as members of the diplomatic corps, you are on the safe side. And despite Saddam Hussein having been a monster, Christians were safe in Iraq. I really have to underline that. Look at today, Christians are not only not safe, they have been kicked out. They are now refugees. Those are the genuine refugees. Those are the genuine asylum seekers. They're not there anymore, and I'll leave it up to you to figure out why. The U.S. may have had a hand in that, unfortunately. So Iran, Iraq, another brush with Islam, though fairly secular Islam. It didn't oppress me living in Iraq, but it was indeed a very interesting experience as a young girl to see the birthplace of civilization. You know, we visited all those ancient, I mean, really ancient sites, like and all those places you study about in history. Babylon. I was in Babylon twice. Okay? I roamed Babylon. I mean, who can say that? As a young child, as a young girl. And I'm very, very grateful for that experience. And also it has made me into a person who appreciates history. Not a lot of people do that nowadays, and you really should know your history well because it helps you in life. Another turning point in my life was moving to the United States in 1983. My father was transferred to the Austrian Consulate General in Chicago, which no longer exists. But back then, he was Consul General for 4 years. His area of duty was the entire Midwest, so all the flatlands of this country, which for a young girl who loves the mountains was a bit of a challenge. The cold winters, you know, I can deal with a cold winter if you know there's a lot of snow and there's mountains. In Chicago, we had only cold and snow, but no mountains. I was suffering, and I'm not kidding. I was very homesick, and the only highlights in my life back then was skiing in Colorado, skiing in Canada, in Lake Louise, skiing in Steamboat Springs, skiing in Reno. Yeah, that was the highlight, and of course spending the summers back home in Austria to keep up my German. I attended a school in Chicago, polished my English, as you can hear, which was very helpful, but the most important thing I learned in that school in 8th grade was the US Constitution. Very important. We had a very good, however liberal, social studies teacher, and she really ingrained in us the importance of the US Constitution, which I personally think is the greatest document ever written and understood by an 8th grader. And if you compare that to the European Constitution, it's about 5,000 pages, and even those who drafted the Constitution could not tell you what it actually says. It is not understandable. You cannot understand it. I've never even seen it. I will not even waste my time on reading a document that no one understands. So, Constitution, and especially, and that's why I'm here tonight, the Bill of Rights, the First and the Second Amendments, and in particular, of course, the First Amendment, which has become very dear to my heart, and which I want to see enacted in Europe, which currently will remain a dream, but maybe one of these days we will rally enough people in Europe to fight for a First Amendment. So, 4 years of Chicago. Despite the difficulty of those 4 years, I'm very grateful for those 4 years. They have shaped me. They have molded me into someone who loves America. I don't think I could live here, but I love America. I love Austria, okay? You have to understand that I'm a traveler between the two continents. I totally get America, unlike many Europeans, most Europeans, who do not understand America, how it works. One example, Tea Party. No one in Europe understands or knows what the Tea Party is about. What was historically the Tea Party? If you don't understand what the Tea Party was in history, how can you understand the movement today? You can't. I instructed my daughter to listen carefully in school in her history class. And if you ask my daughter right now what is the Tea Party, or what was it back then, she'll be able to tell you. And that's what's so important. You have to learn your own history, and then you have to pass it on to the next generation. Because once you lose your history, once you can't remember what the Tea Party was, how are you going to be able to apply it like you guys are doing it? Right? That's what history is all about, in my opinion. So, we moved back to Vienna. I graduated from high school. Did 4 years, I worked for 4 years as a ski instructor. And in the summer, where you can't ski obviously, I was asked if I wanted an internship at the Austrian Embassy in Kuwait. That was May of 1990. And it was supposed to last for 3 months. And you do the math. What happened on October 2nd, 1990? I woke up, helicopters hovering, black helicopters hovering above Kuwait City. I had woken up to a full-blown invasion, which, by the way, I had predicted the night before, but nobody believed me. Everybody said, Saddam, he's just, he's just pretending. The troops are amassed at the border just to scare the Kuwaitis into compliance with the demands. I said, I have had some experience with Mr. Saddam Hussein, and I know that he's not there just to scare the Kuwaitis off. He's going to come and take this country. The ambassador said, no way. I said, just watch. Next day, we woke up, we were in a war. I did what I was taught to do by my parents. I grabbed my car, did some shopping, got some non-perishable groceries, went back to the embassy compound, where I remained for 3 weeks until, with other Austrians who were rounded up from all over the state of Kuwait. And I stayed at the embassy. I was 19 years old at the time, by the way. No mom, no dad, no nobody. And again, the Allahu Akbar screams from the roofs, which sounded so very familiar to what I had experienced back in 1978 and 79. And I will not go into any detail of how I got out, because that's what you should watch when Kat did the interview and started crying. We don't want that to happen again. But I also think you should watch it because it was very raw and very emotional when I talked about what happened to me. But I was saved. Our Austrian president, Kurt Waldheim, saved all the Austrians. He went to Baghdad to schmooze with Saddam Hussein, and I'm very grateful for him, for that schmoozing, because I really did think I wasn't going to survive. I wasn't going to make it. So whatever opinion you have of that man, and I know there are different opinions, he saved my life. I would not be here without him. So that was my third brush with Islam. So 1979, 1983 in Baghdad, 1990 in Kuwait. And back when we were kicked out of Kuwait by Saddam Hussein, when he graciously allowed us Austrians to depart, I remember I turned back, looked at the city. Is it still working? No?
No, looks like we lost them. Did you bump it?
You can hear me now? Yeah.
Yeah.
Back. Okay. Sorry about that. I remember looking back at the skyline of Kuwait, which was pretty back then already, and I said, "You're not telling me when I can leave. I will come back and I will leave out of my own accord, my own decision." I didn't know how I would be able to return, if ever, but I said, if I can do it, I will come back. I did come back a year later when Kuwait had been liberated. I walked the trenches, did a tour of all the... We should actually take a look at that footage at some point. You know, me working the trenches in Kuwait, kind of interesting. But I wasn't ready to stay there yet. I didn't have a job, and you know, you can't live in Kuwait without a job. They won't let you, unlike other countries where they actually feed you for not having, and pay you for not having a job. Kuwait is very strict when it comes to that. You don't have a job, you lose your visa, you're out. Okay? That's how it is, and I think that's a very good model, and there's not a lot of things that I would look to in the Arab world, but you know, their model of having people work, and if you don't have a job, out. I think that's a very good way to do it. I started working for the Austrian Deputy Chancellor in 1995, who also happened to be Foreign Minister of Austria. And that gave me the opportunity to return to Kuwait in 1997. Worked at the Austrian Embassy, same place, slept in the same bed, slept in the same room, had the same desk as previously in 1990. Very eerie. Also had the same car, just a newer model. Again, very eerie. And 4 years of Kuwait meant total immersion into the Islamic religion and culture. Okay? As a non-Muslim in a Muslim society, you have to live Islam, whether you like it or not. Let me give you an example. Ramadan. In Ramadan, whether you are a Muslim or a non-Muslim, you may not eat or drink in public. Very uncomfortable. I never understood why not, because I'm not a Muslim. I'm not forcing Muslims to celebrate Christmas. I'm not forcing Muslims to obey any of our Christian, you know, the Ten Commandments. But that's the way Islam is. It is oppressive. Another example, a Coptic friend of mine, Coptic Christian from Egypt, looked Arab, no denial of that. Christmas time. Christmas in 1998 coincided with Ramadan in Kuwait. He went to the post office to mail his Christmas cards. He got the stamps. Back then, the stamps, you still had to lick them. Nowadays, you don't do that. At least not in Austria. We have, you know, that sticky glue on the stamps. So he started doing that in public, you know, doing what all of us would do. You cannot imagine the uproar. They started cussing him out. They wanted to actually get rid of him. They pushed him out. You're not allowed to do that. You can't. Haram, haram, haram. It was the, you know, haram means forbidden, not allowed. Don't do it. It's simply licking a stamp. Another story. You know how Muslims have to refrain from eating, drinking, and other stuff during Ramadan from sunrise to sunset. If you miss a day for whatever reason, you have to make it up later. You don't really want to do that because 30 days of fasting is already kind of not fun. So I read the newspaper, and it said there's a Ramadan Q&A every day. And one of the questions was, well, I cycle to work every day. What happens if I accidentally swallow a fly while cycling to work? Do I have to make up for that day? Is my fast broken? Did I lose it again? I don't know,
I'm not familiar with the question, I'm sorry.
Okay, well, it's kind of strange.
There we
Anyway,
go.
yeah, I'm back. So can you imagine a fly? Again, to me, that's oppressive. In my book, Islam is oppressive. Okay, next story. So that will lead into why I was convicted. Part of my job was to read the 2 lousy English language newspapers every morning. In one of those newspapers one day, I came across an article about Muhammad and his child bride Aisha, and I read for the first time. She was 6 when Muhammad married her, and the marriage was consummated when she was 9. You can imagine, I was outraged, I was shocked, I was just beside myself. So I ran to the visa section where our interpreter, Jordanian, had his office. And he and I were good friends, we got along very well. And I ran to him and said, Hossein, you know what, maybe this is running out of battery.
Okay.
I think that may be the reason why I keep losing it.
Can we use this?
Yeah, it's not going to be easy for me
Check.
when I speak from, but maybe we can do it like this.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, okay.
I'm the IT guy.
Yeah, well, yeah.
Here we go.
Okay, so this is better, and maybe I'll. Yeah, it's off again. It's the battery.
Okay.
It's definitely
All right.
the battery. Okay, so anyway, you can still hear me, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah.
Good. So I ran to the interpreter, and I said, Hossein, oh my God, you know what I just read about? Can you believe it? And I was expecting him to say, you know, it's a lie. Don't believe it. It's horrible. You know, it's disgusting, and there are people out there who lie all the time. Instead, he looked at me, and he said, and his face, you know, became, you could see the anger, and it was terrible. His face had totally changed his expression. And he said, don't you ever discuss this again. Don't even mention it. And I was there, you know, I was standing in front of him, and I was like, Hossein, what's the matter with you? Why can't we talk about this? Don't even talk about it, he said. He would not discuss it with me. And then I said, well, I mean, is there something wrong with your religion? And he said, he said to me, the religion is good, but the people are bad. I think it should be the other way around. I thank God I didn't look into this in more detail, because I would have gotten in trouble for blasphemy law, breaking, probably even my diplomatic immunity wouldn't have saved me. Austria would probably have sent me back home. So thank God for that. I just pushed it aside, and I said, okay, you know, just leave it. I met my husband in Kuwait. No, he's not a Kuwaiti, he's Austrian. That would have been too much for me to handle. I picked up the last Austrian. He was a UN peacekeeper when there was still the demilitarized zone between Kuwait and Iraq, which is no longer there. We got married. Yeah, one story about Sharia law I'll tell you with respect to getting married. I actually had planned to get married in Kuwait. I said, why not? It's an exotic place, why not get married there? But I did encounter a problem that I was not going to put up with. You see, women in Islamic law, their testimony is worth only half of that of a man. I wanted my best friend to be my maid of honor, which is an official, you know, she would sign the papers. So, you know, it's more than, in Europe, it's more than a maid of honor. She couldn't do that because she was a woman. I would need 2 women. And I said, I'm not playing your game. So I got married in Austria. Okay? Yeah, well, hey, you would have done the same thing, hopefully, right?
Never signed it twice.
Yeah, or maybe you say, well, she has a twin, and that's the twin. Well, that would have been something that I would have done. The rebel. We left Kuwait in 2000. I don't know what got into me. I still hadn't had enough of Islam. I don't know why. So we moved to Libya. I spent a year in Tripoli, Libya, at the Austrian embassy. I was in Tripoli on 9/11. I always tell the story of my landlord, a Libyan, barging into my apartment without even knocking, just opened the door, ran in, started screaming, "The Jews did it!" I knew nothing about the perpetrators that day, September 11, 2001, but I knew one thing: it was not the Jews. I was so certain of that. I could have, it was so clear. I was afraid that it was Gaddafi. That was my fear that night, because then we would have had another attack, because America would have attacked Libya. And I wasn't really interested in getting into that fight again, okay? So in a way, thankfully, it wasn't Libya who was behind 9/11. I left the country, and I left Islam for good in late 2001, returned to Austria, finished my degree. I had not finished university prior to that because I was not mature enough. No, seriously, I wasn't mature enough. No. Finished that when I turned about 30, 31, got pregnant, had my wonderful child, a young daughter. She's now going to be 14 in 2 weeks. She's the love of my life, the light of my life. She's the reason I'm doing this, okay? The sole reason. If I didn't have my daughter, I would be sitting at home reading my Daniel Steele novels, and I couldn't care less what's going on out there. It is my daughter, okay? Love of my life. She needs all the protection that I can give, and I want her to be able to speak her mind freely. That's why I'm doing this. And for all the Ellas, my daughter's name is Ella, for all the Ellas out there, that's why I'm doing it. So I was, I have to back up one more, give you one more reason why I'm doing what I'm doing. When I was living in Kuwait, I used to travel back to Austria for, vacation once a year. And as you know, in 1995, we had all these Bosnian asylum seekers due to the Bosnian War. Well, Bosnians are Muslim, majority Muslim country. Bosnia is a majority Muslim country, so we had all these Muslims coming into the country. We had to absorb them, we had to assimilate them, and every year I traveled to Austria, I would see society changing. The street had changed. I saw more and more hijabs. Back then it manifested itself, the societal change manifested itself mostly through the hijabs in the streets. And of course through breeding, more and more would come, popping out. And more asylum seekers, so-called asylum seekers, were flooding the country. Don't think that the great migration crisis began in 2015. This was just, the climax, basically. We have had an influx of Muslim migrants, immigrants, asylum seekers, illegal immigrants, for many, many years. And this has turned into a crisis, and this is what I was witnessing in the mid-2000s, when I had my little girl, when I was raising her, and then I started reading a book that changed my life, started reading about Islam for the first time, got into theology, started reading the Quran, immersing myself in what I was witnessing, because I wanted to know why this was happening. Why are Muslims the way they are? I wanted to know that. I didn't want to cuss the Muslims. That's not my style. I just simply wanted to understand them, where they were coming from in terms of theology. So I will now, because I'm going to be talking about my case, turn to a prepared speech, because you need to know the fine nuances. I'm not a lawyer, I don't have any legal training, so I need to to read this, and then I will speak freely again after this is done. Okay? I need a sip of water. So, after the situation that I just told you about with the migration deteriorated for the last decade or so, the European Union and its member states have cracked down on free speech. The arrival of so many migrants that I just told you about has accelerated the Islamization of Europe, which tends to be very unpopular. An epidemic of violent crime, more rapes, more harassment of women. The insistence that schools must serve halal food. Sound familiar? The permission for male students to refrain from shaking their female teacher's hand. These are all things that citizens dislike. I also want to add that to this, the bullying that is currently taking place in schools both in Germany and in Austria for girls who do not wear the hijab. Muslim boys will bully their female students to bully the children into wearing the hijab. Unacceptable. Unacceptable. But from the point of the European Union leaders, there's no going back. The migration must proceed. You see that EU leaders want to flip the continent. That's why there is so much migration. To put it bluntly, let's get the whites out, let's get the browns in. Okay? And I don't mean that in a racist way. You know how I mean it. So the plan is to flip the continent, and therefore people must not allowed to be discussed, must not be allowed to discuss these things, nor may they urge their leaders to make changes. Instead, the criticism of Islam and Islamization must be forbidden. The Organization of the Islamic Cooperation, which is a sort of international organization that includes every single majority Muslim country on this earth, 56 plus 1, the one is Palestine. So the OIC and the United Nations call this criticism of Islam defamation of religion, and it has now been criminalized all across Europe. For practical purposes, the European Union is enforcing Sharia law on its indigenous residents. 10 years ago, when I first began this work, the number of political prosecutions for hate speech, in Europe was very small. The cases could be counted on the fingers of one hand. But that number has been increasing steadily ever since and is now rising exponentially. There are now hundreds, perhaps thousands of cases every year in which people are prosecuted for racism, incitement, and discrimination simply for criticizing Islam or mass migration. Unfortunately, many of those prosecuted are being convicted and fined. I just recently, I think this morning, I didn't even tell you about that in the car. This morning I read about a case in Sweden. In Sweden, a woman who had written critically about Islam and mass migration on Facebook received a 3-month mandatory sentence, jail, for writing something on Facebook. Jail time, mandatory. Just this morning I read that. Unfortunately, maybe I should get you the link, right? You want that. Unfortunately, many of those prosecuted are being convicted and fined, and horribly enough, some are being sent to prison. Quod erat demonstrandum, we say in Latin. There are many, many cases of people being prosecuted for speaking the truth about Islam. Far too many for me to tell you about them all. I'll discuss my own case in a few minutes, but first I'd like to say a few words about a friend of mine who is being persecuted and prosecuted by the state. His name is Stephen Yaxley Lennon, otherwise known as Tommy Robinson. He was one of the founders of the English Defense League and was its leader for 5 years. Tommy has been brought to court by the British government numerous times. All of those prosecutions, the hate speech charges and all the others, were trumped up affairs carried out for political purposes. Tommy's most recent conviction was for reporting on the street outside Leeds Crown Court about the defendants in a so-called grooming trial. Grooming, you see, is a euphemism for, and I quote, the sexual slavery of native British girls by Muslim gangs, mostly Pakistanis, unquote. The media and the government do their best to obfuscate what is going on in major British cities. In the space of just 5 hours, Tommy was arraigned, tried by a judge, convicted, and sentenced to 13 months in prison. He spent a brief period in a safe prison, that is, one without too many Muslim inmates, but was inexplicably moved to a prison with a large Muslim population. In order to avoid being attacked and possibly killed by Muslim inmates, he had to remain in solitary confinement. The kitchen staff who prepared the prison's food were Muslims. So in order to avoid being poisoned, Tommy had to survive on meager rations and supplies of canned tuna and fruit that could be sent in from outside. We are all fortunate that the dedicated efforts of his legal team were able to achieve his release after 2 months. If he had spent all 13 months under these conditions, he probably would not have survived. As it is, he left prison looking like an emaciated ghost of his former self. He has recovered well in the 4 months since then, but he acknowledged that the PTSD induced by his ordeal is still afflicting him. And if you watch him in his recent YouTube videos, you can tell that, and he hasn't gained a lot of weight since he left prison. Tommy will be going to trial yet again next spring. News about him spreads through the alternative media because the mainstream media uniformly demonizes him as a racist thug and a neo-Nazi. He needs a top-notch legal team to do battle with the highest levels of the British judicial system, so his defense is being crowdfunded by donations from all over the world, similar to what I'm facing. I also have to crowdfund my defense from all over the world. The real issue behind all these arrests is that Tommy speaks the truth about the danger to the British people posed by Islam. But he's no longer being prosecuted for hate speech offenses. The state does not want the substance of what he says to be aired in an open courtroom and discussed in the national media. Therefore, other types of infractions must be found and charges be brought. The current case against him is simply the latest example of the repressive tactics being employed by the totalitarian British state. So here's the plan. Lock up the most charismatic leader the British counter-jihad has. Put him in with his most dangerous enemies, Muslim criminals who have promised to kill him. Make sure that the guards are absent or looking the other way when the trouble starts. Then, as far as the Sharia-compliant British state is concerned, the problem has been solved. The UK, like all the other enlightened governments of Western Europe, has abolished the death penalty. But there's more than one way to kill a political nuisance. You don't have to march him up the steps to the gibbet, put the noose around his neck, and open the trapdoor under him. What is happening to Tommy Robinson is capital punishment by alternative means. And now for my own case. In early 2008, I began a series of seminars in Vienna under the auspices of the Austrian Freedom Party, explaining to members and other interested parties what Islam, the Quran, and the Hadith, the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, really teach, along with basic tenets of Islamic law. In my presentations, I discussed the consequences for democracy, freedom, and human rights today. For the next year and a half, the interest in my seminars grew and attendance increased. The success of my lectures drew the attention of Austrian leftists who are determined to discredit and destroy the work of those who criticize the tenets of Islamic doctrine. To them, we are racists, fascists, and Islamophobes. Unbeknownst to me, the left-wing magazine called News sent a reporter to one of my seminars to make a surreptitious recording of it. As a result, in late November of 2009, a criminal complaint was filed against me for hate speech. From an Austrian left-wing point of view, my offense was compounded by the fact that my seminars were held under the auspices of the Freedom Party. Despite its popularity with the Austrian voters, even back then, the Freedom Party was back then reviled as a xenophobic party by leftist media and politicians. The complaint against me was not filed by the state, but rather by News magazine, the publication who sent the journalists to infiltrate the seminar. For the next 10 months, the possibility of a formal charge was left hanging over my head, but I received no official word about what might happen to me. All I could do was retain legal counsel and wait. In April of 2010, I gave a deposition to the Office for the Protection of the Constitution and Prevention of Terrorism. After that, there was nothing from the prosecutor's office. Finally, on September 15, I learned that a formal charge would be filed against me. A few days later, I received official notice from the court. My trial date would be November 23rd, 2010. During my trial, the issue of pedophilia came up in light of Muhammad's status as the perfect example for Muslims, as stated in Quran 33:21. You can look it up. I explained what the Hadith collections are, and that they constitute an indispensable part of Islamic doctrine and scripture. I emphasize that I have made up none of what I said. As a matter of fact, my complete 12-hour seminar was fully sourced. You can look at, I have those seminars at home on a stick. I can present that to you anytime. They're fully sourced. So I didn't make up anything, but I simply quoted from canonical Islamic scripture concerning Muhammad's conduct, including his marriage to a little girl named Aisha. The trial was then adjourned until the following January. At the second hearing, excerpts from the seminar recordings were played back, demonstrating that the original charge of hate speech was totally unjustified. The judge then discussed my statement that the conduct of Muhammad is exemplary for Muslims, and took particular issue with the statement, and I quote myself verbatim here because it's very important. I keep getting misquoted in the media. I said the following: what would this behavior, i.e. Muhammad marrying a 6-year-old, consummating the marriage when she was 9, be called today if not pedophilia? You see, I did not say Muhammad was a pedophile. I knew that though that sentence, those words would be actionable. And I was looking for another way to describe it. So I was asking a question: what do we call this behavior? Give me a different word. Give me a different definition. I now know what the clinical definition for pedophilia is, and you should know it too, because in Austria you would be facing a judge if you didn't know it. So when I said those words, I was referencing the Prophet's marriage to a 6-year-old. Evidently aware that the charge of incitement to hatred was never going to fly, the judge, at her own discretion, eventually announced a new charge: denigration of religious teachings of a legally recognized religion. You see, Islam and all the other religions, not every religion in the entire world, but the major religions, are legally recognized religions. That means the Austrian taxpayer gets to fund all the religious ed classes, including Islamic religious ed classes. So my defense was unprepared for this new charge and requested that the trial be adjourned. When the court reconvened in February, events moved very swiftly to a close. The judge decided that the language used in my seminars did not incite hatred, but utterances regarding Muhammad and pedophilia were indeed punishable. In particular, the judge found that the use of pedophilia was factually incorrect, as this is a sexual preference. Listen to this, you're supposed to know that. This is a sexual preference solely or mainly directed towards children. But the judge said that this cannot apply to Muhammad, who was still married to Aisha when she attained the age of 18. Thus, I was found not guilty on the charge of incitement to hatred, but guilty on the charge of denigration of religious teachings of a legally recognized religion, punished with a €480, approximately $500 fine, or 60 days in prison. Now, I have to pause here and explain to you. You might think, oh, you know, $500, you know, you'll find someone to pay it for you, right? And I did. But what you have to understand, the fine was made up from so-called day fines. I received 120 day fines, and those day fines depend on your income. Now, I had lost my job due to all of this. So I received the lowest possible day fine, which is €4. So 120 times 4 makes, equals 480. Now, if I had held a job, maybe even a decent paying job, this could have gone up to €100, €120. Now, you do the math. 100 times 120, that's painful. Okay? So, the verdict from, and I'm kind of ahead now, the verdict from the European Court on Human Rights said, what is she complaining about? She only had to pay $500. It's not that bad, is it? That's not the point. I received a sentence that was 1/3 of the maximum sentence, and I was a first-time offender. So it's not no big deal. It is a very big deal, in my opinion. The charge on which I was convicted was ludicrous on the face of it. Not only did I obviously never say that Muhammad's actions constituted pedophilia, but Muhammad's actions, which were in fact undisputed by the court, included having sex with a 9-year-old girl. If I had said what I was accused of, it would still have been nothing more than the simple truth, but unremarkable to any normal, sane person, like all of us in here. Naturally, I appealed my conviction to a higher court. In December of 2011, the verdict was upheld. Later, the case was considered by the Austrian Supreme Court, which again upheld the verdict in December of 2013. Thus exhausting my options for justice in Austria, I appealed my case before the European Court of Human Rights. And before I tell you a little bit more about that, I have to again explain to you what the European Court of Human Rights is, for you to understand why this verdict is so extremely outrageous. So I'm going to again use my cards with my notes, and I will tell you now that the European Court of Human Rights is the highest court in the area of the so-called Council of Europe. Do not mix it up with the European Court of Justice, which is the highest court in the area of the European Union. We are here talking about the jurisdiction over the countries, the member states of the Council of Europe. And the Council of Europe's jurisdiction extends all the way into Asia and includes lovely countries like Azerbaijan, which incidentally was the judge from Azerbaijan was one of the judges in the chamber that ruled against me. I know. Surprise, surprise, right? The ECHR was established in 1959 by the so-called European Convention on Human Rights, which is the farce that calls itself similar to the Bill of Rights. Nothing could be further from the truth, obviously. The ECHR weighs court decisions in individual nation states like Austria against the European Convention on Human Rights. The two important articles in my case from that convention are Article 10, freedom of expression, which unlike my beloved First Amendment, places restrictions on freedom of expression. And those restrictions depend on the country that you reside in. So Austria has a different set of restrictions than Germany, than France, than the UK, than the Netherlands. It depends on where you are. Now, let me quote from the verdict against me. By the way, do we have any lawyers in here? No lawyers tonight? Okay. Well, if you're interested in reading this terrible and infamous verdict, Kat will receive the link and you can read it in English. So it's not a pretty read. So I will give you one quote. The court found that the domestic courts, i.e. the Austrian court, carefully balanced the right to freedom of expression with the right of others to have their feelings protected. And to have, it gets worse. It gets worse. You don't have to it gets better. It gets worse. It gets worse. And to have religious peace preserved in Austrian society. Now, let me explain this. Freedom of expression is not absolute, according to the court, but should be balanced. One, against the right of others to have their religious feelings protected, and two, to have religious peace in Austria. Have religious peace preserved in Austria. Yeah. So, the first question is, and the court did not explain, who are others? The court does not mention religious rights, but feelings. We're talking about feelings now in court. How do we define these feelings? How are we going to get this into law? How do we make feelings into law? Of course, they didn't say. And consider this. Isn't every critique of a religion more or less hurtful to someone else's feelings? Comes with the territory, right? I mean, and to those who are offended, I say, get over it. I mean, I'm offended every single day by a certain religion, right? I mean, do I go on a stampede? Do I start rioting? Do I start killing people? No. I mean, there is no right not to be offended. But the European Court has now made this into a right. Another creepy fact. Freedom, did you think you were going to have fun here? This could happen here in the United States. Remember that. And it is I will give you examples of how this is already taking place here in the United States. But let me do one step at a time. Freedom of expression, according to the ECHR, has to be balanced against the right to have religious peace preserved in Austria. Thus, the court has said implicitly that any critique of others may thus lead to a breakdown of the fragile peace witnessed in many European cities. You're laughing. This is my reality. This is what I have to live with in Austria. This is what you are going to have to live with if you don't get up and start fighting for your First Amendment. That is why I'm here, to tell you this is what I'm facing on a day-to-day basis. This is the censorship that my daughter has to deal with, the self-censorship that she has to deal with when going to school. Okay, this is our life right now. But you're allowed to laugh because it's better than crying, honestly. The ECHR judgment, and I think this is a very important point made by one of the commentators on my case. The ECHR judgment defends those who threaten violence and not those who engage in debate. And this is what I am all for. We do not have to agree. You can go home tonight and say, oh my God, you know, that was total BS that this lady was talking. That's fine. That's fine. We can discuss it. Okay? You can have your point, I will have my point. I will give you my view, I will give you my evidence, I will give you my examples, and you can give me your point of view. But also, please, don't cite feelings. Oh, I know this Muslim and he's so nice. I want to see concrete evidence from the Quran and from the other books that are relevant to Islam. Don't give me the I know a nice Muslim story. I also know a nice Muslim. So what? Makes no difference in reality. Furthermore, when we talk about disparagement of religions, don't we all know that Judaism and Christianity are routinely disparaged and vilified in secular Europe and also here in the United States? Yes. And no one bats an eyelid about it. No. So what is it with these special privileges? What's the deal? We should stop that right now. The ruling, in addition, also confuses protection of rights and feelings. Again, it's the court balances feelings with rights, a very, very slippery slope. The law should not be about feelings, okay? That's what this is why this ruling is so damaging and so dangerous. And once hurt feelings become a matter of law, religious rights themselves become precarious. You also need to know that. No freedom of speech, no freedom of religion. Very simple. And then also, I was chided by the European Court on Human Rights that my seminars were not objective. Why do I have, who's telling me, where does it say that I have to be objective? I'm not objective tonight. Do I have to be? Do you want an objective presentation? Why? It's my story. My story is by definition subjective. I am talking about what happened to me. I have no one else to present. Okay? So the court demands an objective debate. Okay? And then again, who cares that I didn't meet the standards of an objective contribution to public debate, as stated in the ruling? Who cares? The people who attended my seminar did not expect an objective debate or an objective seminar. So it's a victimless crime. Nobody complained, except for this little journalist who has disappeared, and I'm here. So thank you, madam, for doing this, because I'm now famous and you're not. Yeah. No, seriously. I mean, she gave me the opportunity to stand here before you and argue my case about the importance of freedom of speech. Thank you. I mean, you could have done it in a different way, so as, you know, not to make me go through a whole court case. But, okay, that's the way it is. So I'm grateful to be standing here, by the way. I will now tell you, what's the time, by the way? 8:29. Ooh, okay. I'm telling you a lot of stuff. I will finish up, okay, to give you the opportunity to ask questions. But I do have to tell you, because you're probably thinking, or you may be thinking, well, what does it concern us? We're in America, we have the First Amendment, we're protected by that. No. I will tell you about two problematic resolutions and a House resolution that have already happened, and only thanks to President Trump, they are now basically shelved, but you can bet on it. If the tides change and the country goes blue again, that these resolutions will be out of the drawer and they will be enforced. So the first one you need to know about is a so-called UN, United Nations Human Rights Council, Resolution 16/18. It so happens that the Human Rights Council is made up of all these wonderful countries, champions of free speech and human rights, such as Saudi Arabia and Pakistan and Mauritania. You know, these are all member states of the Human Rights Council. You can go online if you want the rest of the glorious list, you know, check it out.
Iran was also on.
Could be, yes, yes, absolutely. Wonderful, isn't it? This resolution was adopted unanimously in 2012. It targets speech, especially criticism of Islam. This resolution was sponsored, unsurprisingly, by the Organization of the Islamic Cooperation, OIC, and it urges states to take effective measures, I'm quoting here, to address and combat incidences of religious hatred. And 1618 is a call to curtail certain kinds of expressive acts. Now, how does that figure with the First Amendment? Do you think that's compatible?
No.
I don't really think so. You're probably going to wonder, well, what does that concern us? Problem is, it was applauded and forced into almost law, by Hillary Clinton when she was Secretary of State. And she said, and I quote, "We need to overcome the false divide that pits religious sensitivities against freedom of expression." Sounds eerily familiar to my verdict, which is understandable since 1618 was the case law, one of the case law examples for my verdict. See how this could happen to you too? And we're not talking about freedom of religion, or Mrs. Clinton wasn't talking about freedom of religion, First Amendment, but she was talking again about religious sensitivities. Very slippery slope. Freedom of expression and freedom of religion are now pitted against each other. Don't let that happen. That's the slippery slope. Clinton also wanted to advance 1618 by countering offensive speech. This was done in Washington, D.C., where she hosted a high-level meeting with Turkish officials who back then were the mouthpiece of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. And she said, we need to counter offensive speech, and you may have heard those words back then, not by using more speech or discussion, but by using old-fashioned techniques of peer pressure and shaming. Her words. You can actually Google old-fashioned techniques of peer pressure and shaming, and it will pop up under Resolution 1618. And I say to you, the American people do not need government to tell them what to abhor or find offensive. I think you can make that decision on your own, and you certainly don't need Hillary Clinton to tell you that. One last example, slippery slope. When it comes to freedom of speech, I am a fundamentalist. I do not accept freedom of speech with a but. Because anything freedom of speech but nullifies freedom of speech. The OIC says of itself, we are a strong supporter, they actually say a staunch supporter of freedom of expression, but, and I quote, freedom of expression does not entail insulting others, denigrating others, and mocking others. So, did you now see we've come full circle? What happened to me was a classic Sharia law that was enacted on behalf of Muslims. Not even Muslims themselves had to do it. Our own people did it. Yes. Okay? One more example. House Resolution 569, US Congress. 2015. Condemning, the House resolution reads, condemning violence, bigotry, and hateful rhetoric against Muslims in the US. The First Amendment also already protects all citizens, and thank God, also me as a non-citizen. Why do you think I enjoy coming to the US? Because I am free in the US. I am a free person in the US. I can speak my mind. As long as I don't yell fire or defame someone. I mean, the law is there. Okay? You don't need to reinvent the wheel when this BS House resolution. Okay? You understand, this is a slippery slope. Don't think it's over there. And maybe Kat will later, you can tell later on about what happened in Minnesota. Another example.
The Mall of the Americas?
No, something newer. So, I appealed, and you now know I didn't win. The court ruled against me. In reaching its decision, I will now repeat, because it's so important. The court said it carefully balanced her right, Mrs. S., to freedom of expression with the right of others to have their feelings protected. And its decision, the court's decision, served the legitimate aim of preserving religious peace, whatever religious peace is. I don't know, never heard of religious peace. The ECHR's decision has repercussions that extend far beyond Austria. The same reasoning about preserving religious peace may be applied to any country that falls under the court's jurisdiction. And since Islam is the only religion that is ever likely to violate the peace when it is insulted, the court has effectively imposed Islamic laws against blasphemy throughout Europe. In other words, it has instituted Sharia. This is why I have decided to appeal the decision to the Grand Chamber of the European Court of Human Rights. This is my last shot. That's it. No more appeal. It will be completely exhausted, my legal opportunities, possibilities. I can't do this myself. I don't want to do this myself. I have done the last 10 years myself, and the reason I'm here is to also appeal to you to stand behind me and give me your back. Be there for me. Not only financially, because I have to pay my lawyer, but also you have that little card that was handed to you. If you go to that website, on the little card, you will find a petition, a link to a petition that I would urgently ask you to sign, so we can show the European Court that there are so many people out there who will not accept this ruling. And the only reason I'm actually appealing is knowing that there are people out there who will have my back. You may be asking yourselves, why should I care what is happening in Europe? These things are 1,000 miles in an ocean away. Let the Europeans sort it out for themselves. Well, no. You were the ones who saved Europe from National Socialism. Without you, we would still be under the yoke of National Socialists. You're probably going to have to do it again. And in order to do that, you need to be a strong country. You need to be Americans. You need to be there for us. We are counting on you in Europe. We can't do this on our own. Please, please be there for us. Two practical, no, I'm going to skip that. I want you to ask questions. You all know about, I already told you, Europe's present is America's future. Be vigilant, okay? You don't want to end up like Europe. I urge you, therefore, to exercise your fundamental constitutional rights while you still can. Speak up and speak out against what is happening at every opportunity. Thank God for your First Amendment. We don't have that in Europe, and I already told you I wish we did, including the Bill of Rights. And thanks to the Bill of Rights, prosecuting dissenters is much more difficult here in the United States. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's more difficult. Thank God also for the Second Amendment, which happens to make me feel very safe in this room. I hit a nerve, huh? A good one, though. Most Europeans have no ready access to legal firearms. When the refugees assault them, invade their homes, and rape their women and children, they cannot defend themselves. The only thing they can do is call the police, and as you all know, when seconds matter, the police are only minutes away. So I implore you, as an Austrian, I implore you as American citizens and patriots, hang on to your hard-won rights. The Constitution is being taken away from you, despite President Trump, because the deep state is continuing its work. Take action while you still can. You are so fortunate to live in the United States, but large forces are indeed arrayed against you. Your enemies, many of whom are right here in this country or waiting at the border. I don't know where the border is. That way, thank you. They make no bones about what they intend. They want to eradicate American exceptionalism and make the U.S. just like Europe, a subjugated state. Even President Trump is no guarantee that your freedoms will remain. The march to the institutions has been very successful. The same is true of the new Austrian government. The personnel may have changed, but the left is still very strong. People, especially young people, have been and still are being brainwashed by the media, the educational system, and by non-governmental organizations. This is true on both sides of the Atlantic. As for myself, I think you won't be surprised to hear that I will continue to speak the truth, no matter what. I owe as much to my beloved daughter and her children and her children's children. No matter the final outcome, I want her to be able to say, my mommy did everything she possibly could. My friends, Europeans and Americans share a common heritage. We must hang together or we will hang separately. I urge you to stand with me, no surrender, ever, and I thank you very much for coming tonight. Thank you. Yes, I'll ask, I will take some questions. Kat, do you want to quickly tell people about that Minnesota thing that happened?
And then mention the buckets, and we'll get
Okay, sounds good. One of the things I noticed on Facebook yesterday just took my breath away. Because it is so here what she's talking about. Minnesota just set up a state hotline to report people who speak against Islam. Hello, America.
That's what happens when you have a Muslim for Attorney General.
Yes.
Yeah.
But it would have happened anyway.
Yeah. So, you know, this is so critical. And as you were able to hear, Elisabeth is speaking from her heart. No, she's not fighting this battle just for herself. She's fighting for us. And I hope y'all really understand that. I'm sorry. But being on the front lines and you really see what's going on, it all breaks your heart that we're so busy with our cell phones and soccer games and television and all our beautiful amenities. You know, hey, it's Christmas. Do any of us really in this room need a blooming thing? And we can't wake people up to this truth. How do you think the people in Minnesota feel? When I was with Michelle Bachman, and she talked about what's going on in her state last September, she can't wait for an excuse to move away because she said it's gone. If we lose America, there's nowhere else to go. If we lose Texas, there's damn sure anywhere else to go.
Alaska.
So bottom line, we're gonna receive a love offering. Matt has some buckets to pass around. Please earnestly think about what you can give. This is for her legal fund to fight this last fight. So please give generously. She's only got till January the 25th to make this appeal. And so we need to be there. We need to support this. And get your questions ready, because this is your opportunity to ask those questions that you'd really like to know the answer to.
If I can.
Yeah.
Sure, we are hotline. Minnesota.
I talked you about Minnesota, right? In the hotline. Yeah.
The hotline?
Yeah. Yeah, you were sleeping a second ago.
No, I wasn't sleeping. I was getting some fresh water. I'm sorry about that.
That's okay.
Okay, questions. Please speak up because it's being recorded.
Am I correct in saying that in the European Union, you do not have the right to trial by jury?
Not in every case, no.
Please repeat the question.
Am I
In our
correct?
Constitution, we have the right
Yes,
to
trial by jury.
And
Not in this case. I'm not a lawyer, but my case definitely would not have a trial by jury. I think it's capital cases. It's cases under, we have a special law against National Socialism, which always ends in a conviction, always. And people go to jail for their conviction.
we don't have any capital crimes because there's no death.
Yeah, that's true. I'm sorry. Yeah, you're right. You're right. Well, it will return, by the way, because it's hidden in that 5,000-page Constitution, the death penalty. No, not capital crimes, but all these murder, felonies. That is trial by jury. Not my case. I just had the judge, my lawyer, and the prosecutor. That was it. That's it.
No, well, are you talking to me?
Well, is it a follow-up or a new question?
Well, it wasn't a follow-up exactly, but I find interesting, you're from Austria, where Islam was stopped invading Europe in the
1683.
Battle of Vienna in
Yep.
1683.
83.
And then the Austrian School of Economics, and who wrote The Road to Serfdom?
My beloved Hayek.
Right.
Yes.
And
It's
theory
required
of
reading, by the
money
way.
and credit,
Hayek.
Ludwig von Mises.
Yes.
The thing is, what's surprising is that how the people let this happen, even though they're in their culture before, and I'll call it their academia, that they were first.
I can tell you why it's happening, and it has very little to do with Islam. The reason it's happening is cultural Marxism, Frankfurt School. Yep. If you look that up, that is the reason. Islam is just a symptom of the problem. Okay? If you read your cultural Marxism, there are lots of good books out there on cultural Marxism. It will explain to you how we got to where we are right now. Again, Islam is simply one symptom. Okay? The loss of the family unit is another symptom. Breaking up the family. Kids belonging to the state rather than to their parents. Lots of reasons. I'm not here to speak about cultural Marxism, but perhaps you should think about inviting a speaker who knows about cultural Marxism and maybe juxtaposes it with the road to serfdom. That would be an interesting topic to discuss.
And Islam believes in socialism.
Exactly.
So
exactly.
It fits.
Exactly.
But the left doesn't understand that if the Muslims ever gained control, they would be some of the first ones.
Well, look at Iran. Those who don't.
That's right.
Okay. Well, you know what I'm trying to say. Yes,
I want to say,
yes.
one thing I forgot to say, if anyone does want to make a check, if you will leave who it's to blank and the memo blank, because I don't have the info in front of me to tell you what's right, it'll be a tax deductible donation, okay? Fill in the dollar amount though, thank you.
That would be helpful, yes.
Or leave that blank and we'll
Question. The gentleman behind you, then, ma'am, it's your turn. Yes, please, go ahead.
The Muslim religion advocates death to non-believers. How do you combat that? I mean, it's an inevitable direction of that.
You know that, I know that. There's some people who ignore it. Many people ignore it. They say, oh, it just says it in the book. It will never happen.
It's like the Aryan race under Nazis.
Yes, exactly.
Exactly, same thing.
That's exactly what it is.
Doesn't Poland disallow Islam in Japan?
Yeah, it's interesting. Poland, there's a wonderful member of parliament who recently said, and he also said it here in the United States in St. Louis in summer, he's all for building mosques in Poland. He has absolutely no problem with that. As long as the same number of churches are built in Saudi Arabia. Yeah. Yeah. And I agree with him. Let's build as many mosques in the United States with the same number built in Saudi Arabia. Fine with me.
Yeah.
Okay?
Let's equalize first.
Exactly. For every mosque, there's a church in Saudi Arabia. It's never going to happen, so we should have no mosques. But of course, all the leftists will scream, freedom of religion, freedom of religion. Yeah, well, okay, ma'am?
Hi. You mentioned somewhere in your talk something like the leaders of Europe want to switch the whites to the South. What is the cause? Is fear the reason? Why are they thinking that?
No, there's no fear. They're very sure of what they're doing. Very, very convinced.
What's the reasoning for that?
Votes, power.
Power, but I mean, what I've read, like say in France, there are places where policemen won't go.
Yes.
So of course there's fear, and I think you also had mentioned that it's not popular, this immersion of people from such different cultures and who do not integrate, because it's difficult. But there has to be I think they're afraid of these people.
No, they're not afraid of these people.
Well,
Not yet.
No, they're not afraid of these people. I see no fear in any politician in the European Union. Nobody's afraid. Why should they be? These are the people who are going to vote the current politicians into office.
As long as they get 51% of the vote, they don't care about
No,
the
they
other
don't care
49%.
who it is.
They
They
don't care about the
know.
Constitution.
but these are highly trained rationals.
You are being way too kind to these people.
No, these
Way
are
too
leftists.
kind. If you look at Emmanuel Macron, if you look at Theresa May, at Angela Merkel, if you look at Sebastian Kurz, our boy chancellor, all of 32 years, none of them has any children. What do they care? Look at them. Nobody has kids. They don't care. They live for this moment. They want to be reelected. They want their program to go through. They want the European Union. They want the money. Exactly. Why should they care? Don't give them so much credit. You're giving them way too much credit.
And may I just
Yeah,
say
yeah.
one other thing, is not in relation to that, but within the United States, I've read that there was a clinic, a Catholic, in Buffalo, New York, or somewhere up in northern New York State, that has been in existence for 90-some years, placing children in homes, fostered, for adoption. And it has closed its doors because it's Catholic, because they're forced to put children in unions between same sex.
Yeah.
And since the Catholic Church and many other Christian churches will not accept that as a family, although those people are loving and good and kind, but they're not married. and they had to close their doors, and the doctors are being told, if you don't perform an abortion, you must refer that patient to someone who will perform the abortion. That is the law, as far as I know in some states. Well, that would be like saying, if you won't commit murder, you have to find someone who
Find
will.
someone else who will do it.
So that's already happened.
Cultural Marxism. That's exactly what it is. Okay.
1, 2, 3.
Okay.
1, 2, 3. Were you pointing at me or somebody behind me?
Behind you, then you're 4 if you want to say something.
Yes, going back to cultural Marxism, I've heard it said from other sources that the international left is using Islam as a sort of hammer to smash Western values, Western culture and everything. But I don't think they realize that they're going to be ensnared with Sharia law eventually. But they think they're going to be in charge.
Absolutely. Totally agree with you. Just look at what happened in Iran. The Iranian communists supported the return of the Ayatollah Khomeini back in 1978. As soon as he touched down, his plane touched down in Tehran, they were the first to populate the world-famous Evin prison. They were killed right away. I don't understand how, if you know your history, you know exactly what's going to happen.
We don't teach it anymore.
And if they don't teach it, then it should be your responsibility to teach your children.
Yeah.
Okay? That's what I do with my daughter.
Yeah.
Okay? She actually reads the Quran. Just so you know.
I'm most likely the only countryman of yours here, but also a legal immigrant.
Well, that's exactly how it should be. Good for you.
But to make your point a little further, you mentioned the switch from white to brown, and you say, oh, they want to be elected. They're not going to be elected.
Well, you know that. I know that.
Yeah, but are they that stupid? I mean,
Yes, they are. They're opportunists. They're opportunists, yes, and they can be bought. I can't be bought. I think you know that, right? I mean, if you told me you would give me $1 million for my legal fund, but I would have to change my wording from Islam to Islamism, I would say, no, thank you. You can keep your money. Because I believe there's no Islamism.
That's right.
You can't buy me. Okay? That's the difference between the politicians and Miss S.
That's so difficult to understand, and I hear you, because it doesn't make sense, really. And we see the same thing in this country.
But the world doesn't make sense. It's upside down.
Do they make sense to us?
No.
I mean, so the same kind of mindset.
And it's 2 + 2 = 5 and not 4. So as long as we argue the point that 2 + 2 = 4, we're never going to understand the politicians. It won't work. They believe 2 + 2 = 5. It's their firm belief.
And if they don't have a religious fundamental value, they have no intellectual honesty or moral integrity. Therefore, they will say anything and do anything to accomplish their ends.
Yes.
That's what people of moral values don't seem to understand. I've been all over the world.
Yeah.
They don't understand the fact that they aren't like us.
Yeah.
They aren't Christians in the sense, or Jewish people with this fundamental set of moral values, which is reflected in our Constitution, our Declaration of Independence, and the philosophy of conservatism upon which this country was founded.
Thank you.
What is the actual purpose of this Islamic migration, not only to the U.S., but to every country?
Do you have another 24 hours?
Well, I know that outside of world disruption, which has occurred in their countries, but we're not allowed to migrate to their countries.
No.
But what
You wouldn't
is...
want to.
No, I can give you one simple answer.
Is it a religious purpose
Yes, it is.
behind it?
Yes,
Is it
there's
to
a
take
religious,
over other governments? What is the purpose?
There's a religious tenet behind it. It's called hijra, and it means immigration from Islamic lands to non-Islamic lands in order to Islamize those countries, because the ultimate goal of Islam, peace, will only be achieved if the entire world is made Islamic? That's the simple reason. Those nice people in the establishment will accuse me of fear-mongering, conspiracy theories.
But now take this just on another side, and I'm not trying to be on the liberal side.
Yeah.
But hasn't Christianity also tried to take Christianity to all parts of the world?
By the sword?
To make it a Christian?
By killing people?
Yeah, that's the
Well,
difference.
during the times of,
No, we were actually mistaught. That was actually started by the Muslims.
yeah, during the
invading.
time of the Crusades.
No, the Crusades were defensive.
Yes, that's what we were taught wrong in
Yes,
school.
you need to go
Yes.
back and reread it. The Crusades were defensive because of the looting and killing and pillaging by Muslims of that area. So the Crusades were called to save their Christian brothers and sisters in the Holy Land.
And it's
We are taught, we're being mistaught.
So basically, it's a religious thing
It's a religious
to
tenet.
infiltrate.
Yeah,
the
not
world.
infiltrate. You can do it very officially. The Muslims this is part of their DNA.
Okay.
They must proselytize. They must find new converts.
So
This
the way
is-
for them to go to heaven
Yes.
is the only guarantee is to take out a Christian or a Jew.
But that's only men that go to heaven.
Exactly, that's another one, but we're getting too far into theology. It's too soon to get into theological discussion. Read up on the Crusades.
I'm glad that you are educating me.
May I suggest a book? Robert Spencer,
Okay.
The Total Idiot, is it the Total Idiot's Guide, or is it the
Yeah.
Indispensable
Idiot's
Guide?
Guide.
This brand new one,
History of
Jihad
Jihad.
from the beginning to, what?
History of Jihad.
The
That's
Yes,
the latest
please
one.
read Robert Spencer, The History of Jihad, but there was also a book prior to that.
The Idiot's Guide to Islam.
Yeah.
The Infidel's Guide.
Idiot's
Yes.
Guide, yeah.
Yes.
What the amazing thing is, by the time we were in school, this was already going on. They had already changed history in our books when we were in school in the 60s and 70s, because we were taught, how we, the Christians, were going and killing and doing. No, wrong. It was the Muslims.
Can I also tell you something that I myself had to go through? I had to go through the exact same enlightenment that you're going through right now, and mine was even worse, probably. Do we need to finish up? Yeah, one more question, but let me tell you this story quickly. There's a wonderful author of Egyptian origin. She's Jewish. She lives in Geneva. Her name is Bat Yor.
Yeah.
Has written a must-read book called Eurabia, in which she chronicles it's a very dense book. It's a hard read, but it's well worth reading because it does explain the creeping Islamization of Europe, which began in the late 1960s under Charles de Gaulle, and the reason and how it is taking place through the parliamentary commissions, through exchange programs between Europe and Arab countries, through scientific exchange, through university exchange. And part of this is the vilification, part of this program is the vilification of Jews. So I wasn't in school, in an Austrian school for many years, but I was in Austrian schools long enough to have been subconsciously taught that Jews aren't good. Okay? And once I got into, I was never, it wasn't openly anti-Semitic, but you always had this feeling, stay away from Jews, not good.
Like a little undercurrent.
Yes, exactly. And when I got into this work, that's where I started understanding that this is untrue, that how I was duped by the educational system. And Bat Yor's book, again, I highly recommend it, helped me understand how evil this program is. Okay?
Could you spell the author's name?
Yes, B-A-T, as in bat.
B-A-T?
Yes. And it's a pseudonym, of course. And her last name is Y-E''O''R. Bathior.
Apostrophe what?
O-R.
O-R.
Okay? Wonderful book called Eurabia. She has written other books as well. But in this instance, if you want to understand the transformation and why this happened, read that book. One question, actually that was supposed to be the last one.
David has one right there.
Go ask hers first, mine's quick, so go
Mine
right
is
there.
a statement. What I found during this midterm election, I was vacillating between sickness in my heart to just incredible anger about how people were treating each other.
Yeah.
You know, I don't want to feel anger towards someone feeling just because they're a Democrat or a liberal or whatever, because we're still all Americans, you know?
That's missing. I miss that.
I hate that.
I grew up here in the States. It didn't matter if you were liberal or
I wanted people to
conservative.
vote. I didn't care if you were Democrat. I didn't care if you were liberal. Just get out and vote. Just don't be so ugly to each other. Don't be harassing each other. It made me sick seeing young people acting that way on television. You know, on the news. And you know, I was drawn to it, and I thought, why am I doing this? I hated seeing, you know, poor Trump, he couldn't even step into England without people protesting without them even listening to what he had to say.
I know.
And
That's what I'm here for, to tell you, we need to talk to each other.
Europe needs us. Europe didn't give a crap about him even coming, and it made me sick to my stomach.
Didn't I want to say something about that too? How Europeans are being indoctrinated by the media. Yes, I want to tell you just quickly, the media, the entire media, all over Europe, I can generalize that, are writing op-eds, commentaries. There is nothing, not a word that is written about Trump that is not vindictive, evil, wrong, just plain wrong.
It is as bad as we are. It's just as
Well, you know, you guys, you know him. But the Austrian people don't know who Donald Trump is.
I feel like nobody knows who he really is.
No, I understand him. I think he's a breath of fresh air. I love it how the left cringe. I love it. I think it's great. I don't agree with everything he does, but
This is what my feeling is. I think he really loves America.
I think he does.
He's a businessman.
Yes,
He's
I
not
agree.
a politician.
Yeah.
He speaks from his heart,
Yeah.
and he doesn't always, it's his delivery. So what?
Yes.
Give him a chance. He's had 2 years. He's barely into it, and he has made so much progress, and people, just because he doesn't talk like a politician, because he says what he's saying,
Yeah.
and you understand what he's saying, you don't like the way he said it, so what?
Exactly.
And I just,
I
I'm so
agree with
sick.
you.
I'm so glad that midterms are finally over, let's just keep going.
Yeah, let's get to work. Go, David.
Just a comment to capitalize on what you said. The Organization of Islamic Cooperation is the largest voting bloc of the United Nations.
Yes.
So it's time for Chip Roy, time for Cornyn and Cruz to earn their pay and get us out of the United Nations.
Correct. Thank you. Thank you. I agree.
If I could say something very quick. Firstly, I'm a professional military and worked in all kinds of industries as well. The first thing you have to understand is your opposition. If you don't understand the opposition, you don't know what they're doing, how they're going about it, what their intent is, and therefore you let them refund you. You have to strike at their heart. And what they're trying to strike is destruction of the Constitution, original Constitution. You hear all this about the living Constitution. They care about rhetoric, not substance.
Yes.
You heard that with Obama.
Don't get him started.
You didn't even know how many states there were.
Well, there's 57.
Well,
in the
that was most of
United
them.
Nations of the OIC that he's talking about.
But that's how they're able to get into power. Fortunately, in the United States, we do have trial by jury. We have, especially about no warrantless searches. We have the Second Amendment. Why does every totalitarian government since Assyria, where it's first documented, try to control three things? Your religion, because that's what's in your heart. That's what you're willing to die for. Secondly, is controlling who has arms. And the third thing is education. Because that's how they, and you see that in Western Europe. That's what the communists did. That's what the Nazis did. That's what the Italian fascists did. That's what the Japanese fascists did. And finally, that is exactly what the modern liberals in this country have done, and they're controlling education. And we aren't demanding that the control of education be returned to parents, not school boards, but parents.
Right.
And take it away from them.
Yep. Thank you. Okay, with this, I really would like to thank you. I am thanking you from the bottom of my heart for coming here tonight, for your generosity, for driving all the way from Austin. Thank you to see me. I love seeing you again. Thank you, Tammy. Thank you, Dave, for coming. Really appreciate it. And I'm going to leave you with a Schwarzenegger. I will be back. Thank you. Drive safely.
Lots of cookies still in the back. Please hang around and visit.